Hey, how you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
All is well. Thank you so much for coming on the platform. I really appreciate you taking out the time to stop by. I want to give you a heads up. I'm currently in East Africa, so it's not as technologically advanced. So if we get disconnected, you can continue to speak and it'll record and then I'll edit it.
Okay. So where are you right now?
I'm in Madagascar.
Madagascar. I'm jealous. I've never been there.
Oh, okay. But you've been in Africa before. I'm really excited to hear about the amazing work that you've been doing. For the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know what your name is and definitely what do you do?
So I'm Craig Packer. I am a professor at the University of Minnesota. And for many years, I headed the Serengeti Lion Project in Serengeti National Park and in Ngorongoro Crater in Tanzania. And these days, I'm now the scientific director for the Mara Predator Conservation Program in Kenya in the Masai Mara and its surrounding conservancies.
Wow. Okay. Okay. That's amazing. That's truly amazing. Now, I've traveled around Africa. I've been to maybe 20 African countries, but I haven't been to the Serengeti. That's a place that I really want to go see. You know what I'm saying?
Put it on your list.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. Now I have to ask you this. When did you develop this passion for, I guess, is it zoology and wildlife? Is this something that you've always wanted to do, or did you kind of get into it later in life?
Well, when I was a kid, um, I just wanted to be a scientist, and I had no idea what kind of scientist. And but I also like to spend a lot of my time outdoors. And so my grandmother had a small farm in West Texas, and I used to spend as much time outside as possible, and looking for arrowheads. And uh, my uncle was taking a course in entomology in college at the time, and he needed somebody to collect bugs for him. And so he gave me a butterfly net, and I went out and I started catching bugs. I thought, well, this is fun. And so as time went on, I went to college, and I knew I was going to be a scientist, but I didn't know what kind. And then, sort of in my third year of college, there was an opportunity for me to go to Tanzania to work with Jane Goodall on primate research in Gombe Stream National Park, right on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. And I got there, and at first I wasn't all that thrilled to be watching monkeys because they'd go up trees. I couldn't really see what they're doing. But after a while, I got really hooked on it. And I decided, well, this is science. And I'm outdoors. What could be better than this? And so I ended up having that as sort of the launching pad for then going to graduate school, coming back to Gombe, doing more work on the primates. And then I found out there was an opportunity to take over the Serengeti Lion Project. And I said, I'm in, I'll do it. And so at that point, I became a carnivore biologist, and I've been doing it ever since.
Wow. Okay. Okay. That's definitely inspiring. Now I can ask you this. You kind of went back in the day. Was it any I guess reservation for you to travel to Africa at that time, or did your family have any concerns? Because now you have so many bloggers, you got YouTube, you can look up so much stuff.
That's a really good point. I wasn't worried about it because I guess, again, when I was a kid growing up in Texas, my family and I would go down to Mexico a fair amount. And so I was kind of used to going to other countries. And of course, Mexico in those days was economically much further along than Africa. But the people at college who helped to set up this program at Gombe, they said, no, it's all fine. And I just didn't worry about it. So I got there. And in the end, actually, I should have been more worried about it. It didn't happen my first year, but when I was back as a graduate student, and I was in my second year doing my field work there, there were uh, really serious issues across the lake in what at the time was Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so the American government had helped to install a very corrupt and cruel president of Zaire named Mobutu. And there were a number of uh, rebel groups who were trying to overthrow the Mobutu regime. And one of them was based just across the lake. And we didn't know any of this at the time, but I happened to be on holiday on the coast of the Indian Ocean somewhere, and I got word that a group of armed rebels had come across the lake at midnight and kidnapped some of my friends from Gombe and were holding them hostage. And so, whoa, we suddenly realized that maybe we were a little bit naive to think that we could have a research station which is effectively on an international border across the lake from a very unstable government.
Wow. Okay. Okay. I appreciate you sharing that. Now I kind of want to backtrack a little bit. The classes that you teach, are they like in a traditional classroom, or do you kind of go outside of that?
Well, so I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota, and I do all my undergraduate teaching in a traditional classroom, but they're flipped classrooms. And so the way it always used to be is where everybody would sit in a large auditorium and fall asleep while the professor would drone away with a lot of, you know, cluttered slides and mumble into his beard or whatever. But what we do now is that we have tape recordings of our lecture material, and that's what the students see at home before they come to class. And then we do in-class activities the whole time they're there. So we give them problems to solve, we have them look up things on the web and wherever, and then we discuss with them what they've been learning in class. So that's all in Minnesota, and that's what I do in the fall each year.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Now, okay. It's a lot of people I interview. If they're in medicine, if they're in law, if they're in music, in movies, I usually ask them about what are their thoughts on AI and technology.
Mhm.
Has it been something that you've been able to utilize, and you know, just what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's an interesting. I'm always keen to find whatever's new and see if it's useful. And I actually, when it first came out, Chat GPT, a lot of my colleagues were worried about, oh no, now people will, you know, they'll just ask Chat GPT for all the answers, and the answers will be written for them. But on the first day of class, I have people use Chat GPT, and I say, now ask them something obvious, and it'll give you a pretty good answer. But if you ask something that's really kind of cutting edge, it makes stuff up. And even if it's right answers, they tend to be very general and vague and boring. So I just want you to see how bad those answers are compared to what you're able to write yourself. And so that's why I use it in the classroom. For my own research, there are times when I'm trying to ask some questions about something I know very little about. I'll ask ChatGPT, and lo and behold, I get a lot of what they call hallucinations. I call them lies because it will confidently tell you something that's just dead wrong. But what I learned fairly quickly was that I could check on that. And so if I got something that seemed, wow, that's really fascinating, now let me go on Google and see if I can find a scientific paper or some other source that will confirm that story. I'll find not there. So it's a tool, and I suppose it'll get better and better. And I think in some ways we should just go ahead and embrace it. But in other ways, I think you just until that magic day is reached, just be very suspicious.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. You have to double check. Now, I can ask you this because I was checking out your wiki profile, and like I can confirm with you, you got a chance to study the snow monkeys in Japan. Is that true?
Yes.
Oh, can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, that was really fun. So um, I'd done my work in Gombe in Africa, and my study was on baboons, which is the largest monkey in Africa. And I was interested in comparing baboons to the behavior of some of the the monkeys that are found in Asia. And but I was spoiled by my experience in Africa because people had already studied those monkeys for a while. And here's the thing about a long-term study of animals is that if you watch a group of animals, to begin with, you just don't know anything about what's going on. But after a while, you begin to realize, oh, there's a family within this larger group, and that the mother is still close with her daughters, and the sisters have their own kind of relationships. And so, in looking for another monkey species outside of Africa that had that kind of information, I could go there and they could tell me, oh, yeah, that's so and so's grandmother, that's so and so's cousin. It had to be in Japan. And so we went to Japan and went around looking for a good place to study the Japanese macaques, and then finally settled on a place called Hakkasan, which is on the main island, and it's up in what are called the Japanese Alps. And so you've seen pictures there, and that site and other nearby places that still have the wild monkeys, in the really cold weather, the monkeys are really smart and they hop into the hot springs and they keep themselves warm. And so yeah, so that was really fun. Except that the only places in Japan at that time that had natural forest left, so that the monkeys would range up and down the mountains, the terrain was so steep that it was almost impossible to follow them away from these hot springs or from their feeding areas. And even if we did, there are these Japanese goats. They're called Japanese sero, and it's a wild goat species. And if they got startled, they might inadvertently knock loose a large rock that would come down. You know, these landslides coming down at you from these slopes. So we ended up just being there for a couple of months, and in the end, switched to lions instead.
Oh, okay, okay. I appreciate you sharing that. Now I wanted to talk to you about so I guess the lion population is shrinking. If you can talk about I guess where is it at currently and how long has this been going on?
Well, I think the lion population in Africa has been shrinking steadily, probably for over a century, because the human population has grown so much over that period of time. And also, as there's been clearing of a lot of land to feed that population, a lot of natural habitat has been plowed up to grow maize, which they call in Africa, which we call corn in the US, wheat, and other staple crops, pineapples, cotton. And so a lot of habitat's just been lost to meet the needs of the human population. And then what we see now are areas where the remaining habitat that has not been converted to farmland is occupied by pastoralist people. These are people like the Maasai and others whose livelihoods depend on livestock. So these areas are too dry to grow crops, but you can still turn grass into food by way of eating the goats and the sheep and the cows. But in those areas, the people themselves have lost a lot of their original habitat. Now they're scrunched up against the protected areas that have the wildlife. And so people are trying to earn a living by raising their livestock at the same time that lions now are losing some of their prey because the grass has been eaten by the cows. And so the lions now are trying more and more to eat livestock themselves. And so this leads to conflict, and the lions are either speared or shot with bows and arrows or even poisoned in retaliation. And so if you look across all of Africa, the first place that lost its lions actually was South Africa, because you had so much European settlement down there. The land was very good for agriculture, and it was just plowed. And lions were more or less went extinct in South Africa, except for marginal populations along their borders with Botswana on one side and Mozambique on the other. And then next was West Africa. And so West Africa has a very dense human population. Much of West Africa is too rainy to support lions. There aren't that many patches, what we would call savanna, that lions like to occupy mostly. And so, again, the human pressures there were very intense. And there's very few lions left in West Africa, maybe 250 across that whole area from Senegal all the way to Congo. But in East Africa, the human population has only reached that level, and the level of well, climate change too is actually playing a role in East Africa, drying out these rangelands, so that now people are coming ever closer into contact with wild lions, and the lions are losing out in return. So the overall, the population of lions has probably shrunk by 80 to 90% over the last century. And the remaining areas, though, are mostly in protected areas and national parks and other kinds of game reserves. And even now in South Africa, there are more lions in South Africa today than there were 100 years ago, because a lot of people have decided that they could earn more money by converting their ranches, their cattle ranches, into tourist attractions with wildlife. And these are quite large. They can be like 1,000 square kilometers. And so they have now translocated a lot of the species that were gone back into these fenced reserves. So South Africa is stable, Namibia, Botswana, reasonably stable because those are desert countries and the habitat that remains for lions is well protected. In East Africa now, there are more conservation efforts that are having some success in protecting lions in these pastureless areas. But West Africa, I don't know that that has much of a chance of ever recovering.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Now I can ask you: is there anything in particular that I guess the government can do, or is it something that is it a global effort, or people all around Africa have to individually do certain things?
Well, I think the best thing people can do is to. There are a couple of organizations that I think are worthy of support, sort of charitable support, that their donations help to protect lions. There's the Nature Conservancy in the U.S. looks after some wild areas in Africa. There's also an organization called African Parks, and that's actually a private organization that is now managing about 2 dozen national parks across Africa. And their support is really important because they've gone to countries that have very little tourist revenue. And so they might have a national park on a map, but they cannot afford to support any rangers to go out and protect the areas. So African Parks has actually taken over management of a number of those sites, and they've been quite effective because the charitable donations to African Parks is substantial and enough to pay the cost to support the rangers, to protect the wildlife in those areas. So that's a charitable way forward. Another way forward is for people who can afford it, is go to Africa and go to some of these parks and see for yourself what life is like, and maybe you'll find other ways that can help out. Because a lot of the problems in Africa are not strictly wildlife. Often it's because of poverty. Because Africa is the least developed continent on Earth, and many countries, the level of poverty is truly staggering. And so there's no surprise that people then have to resort to catching their own dinner, whether it's a wild species or whatever. And so this takes away the prey. But anything that can help advance the development, economic development in these countries, can make a really important difference.
Definitely, definitely. Now I can ask you this: the with the population decrease of the lion, how does it compare to, say, maybe the leopards and the cheetahs? Are they kind of in the same boat, or is it?
So I'm guessing here. So in the last estimate I've seen for lions is probably between 20 and 30,000 lions across all of Africa. Leopards are much harder to count because they're so secretive. And also, they still thrive in areas outside of the protected areas. They will eat domestic dogs, for example. They'll eat an occasional goat or sheep, but they tend to just eat one at a time, and so people don't get quite so upset. Whereas if lions go in, they kill cattle, which have much greater value, and the lions will rather annoyingly kill 6 or 8 at once rather than just one. So leopards, I mean, it really would be a guess, but certainly more than lions. Cheetahs, I think the last I heard is probably about 10,000 or less. Um, yeah, so those are the three that you asked about. Oh, tigers. I think tigers are also on the order of about 10,000 across all of Asia.
Okay, okay. Now I wanted to ask you about this. I seen this online. You studied the effects of a full moon and its correlation to the number of lion attacks. If you could speak about that.
Sure. So we might think that man eating is a thing of the distant past, but in fact, it still goes on. Lions in these human occupied areas do occasionally turn to humans as prey. And there was a really serious outbreak of man eating lions in the 1990s and the early 2000s in southern Tanzania. And we were asked by the Tanzanian government to try to find out why that problem was so bad in the southern part of the country and what could be done potentially to help. And so we got the records because whenever a human being is harmed by a large animal like that, there's record keeping. And so even in a poor country like Tanzania, there's records kept by game officers that get back to the central office. And so we were given access to all their data on man eating over this period of time. And we discovered that the man eating really was, well, obviously it was known by the victims themselves and their communities that the most attacks occur at night. And so one of the things that is really exceedingly impressive about lions is their capacity to move around and see things in the dark. And so we're primates and we have really good vision for the daytime, but when it gets dark, we're not very good at seeing anything unless the moon is very bright. And in these rural areas in tropical Africa, the moonlight is super bright at the full moon. And so you can literally read a newspaper outside at the full moon. And so that means that the lions don't have that advantage they usually have over their prey. And so you can see, during a dark night, zebra and wildebeest, they kind of stumble around a bit. They're not, they're very much more vulnerable. And so we found from our studies in the Serengeti that the most of the daytime kills that we would see uh, by the lions were during the time of the full moon because they couldn't catch anything at night. We also found the lions scavenging more around the full moon because again they couldn't get anything at night. And at the new moon, at the darkest times of the year, we could see that the lions, we you can sort of use an informal gauge of how fat a lion is by how much he looks like he's just swallowed a watermelon. And the lions had fatter bellies around the new moon, and they were thinner around the full moon. So they can't hunt very successfully. They don't get much to eat around the full moon. When we looked at the data that we got from the Tanzanian government, we had a very striking result that just popped out at us that the most dangerous times for people being attacked by lions were the first 4 or 5 days after the full moon. And what we could see was that these are the first dark periods of time after the full moon when people are out walking around. So most of the lion's prey, they don't go indoors, but people are only outside in the evening. We sleep till dawn, right? And so, but we're out wandering around. People go to church, they go to the bar, they do whatever uh, between sunset and going to bed. And so they're out and about during the hours after sunset. Now, as the moon phase goes along, the nights get brighter and brighter. And then the night of the full moon, the moon is up at sunset. And so it's still bright that night, all the time that people are outside. But the next night, after the full moon, there's an hour until the moon comes up. So this is the first hour of darkness that the lions will experience, and they're hungry, and people are out walking around. And so this continues for another few days, and then it gets dark enough again, and the lions can start eating their other prey.
Wow, I appreciate you breaking that down. Wow, man, that's amazing. Now I can ask you this: we 26 minutes in. Are you working on any current projects, or do you have any upcoming projects?
Yeah, I'm working on a couple of things. One of the things your listeners might be interested in is I'm in the middle of writing a book about man eaters. And it's not just lions that eat people, but also wolves, leopards, tigers, as well as lions. And there have been periods of time in our history, our recorded history, when there have been really horrible outbreaks of man eating. So that outbreak we were looking at in Tanzania, there were about 1,000 people were attacked over a 15-year period. And there are other periods like that further back in the past. And like, for example, wolves. Did you know? Did you know that in France alone, 10,000 people were attacked and killed by wolves in France alone between 1525 and 1900? 10,000. And it's crazy. And so I've been going through looking at all these worst cases, these worst times in history. So that horrible time in France during the 15, 16, and 1700s, in Russia during the 17 and 1800s, in India in the 1800s, particularly in the early 1900s for leopards and tigers, in the 20th century for lions in Africa. And the common theme for what triggers these is there's some horrible disaster going on, whether it's war, whether it's pestilence, or whether it's famine. And so, literally, you have the four horsemen of the apocalypse: war, pestilence, and famine, followed by the wild beasts of the earth. And that actually is a pretty biologically accurate explanation for man eating, because in war, it generates a lot of dead bodies lying around. You also devastate the habitat, a lot of habitat destruction by the military actions. In famine, you have sometimes hundreds of thousands of starving people out roaming around and looking for whatever they can find to eat, eating the wolf's prey, eating whatever would ordinarily keep the carnivores at a safe distance away. Same with pestilence. And so these are primarily the triggers that have led to the worst outbreak of man eating in history.
Wow, that's interesting. I look forward to that. I'm gonna have to check that out. It sounds like a sci-fi movie or a television series or something. You go
It
to each
does, doesn't it?
country, wolves,
It's crazy.
lions.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
And yeah, and beyond that, I mean, once these things get started, people themselves kind of take advantage of them. And so, like in Europe, there were a lot of people who were suddenly being seen as werewolves because people
Yeah.
were really being eaten by wolves. And then
Hmm.
you'd have a psychotic serial killer, kind of like a modern
Hmm.
day serial killer, but then he'd be called werewolf. And so there's all
Hmm.
these things go into the human psyche. It's an amazing subject.
Wow, wow. Okay. So I want to thank you so much again for being patient. You know, the internet held up. I appreciate the
Yeah.
work that you have done, and I definitely look forward to the book and the work that you have coming in the future.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me.
All right, man. Take care.
Bye bye.